Hi everyone, we're back again, and we're on to the next stage of the portrait here, the demonstration that I'm getting set to do. And basically right now I've got everything laid out, but now I'm going to go ahead and start laying in the larger, blocking in is what I call it, blocking in the painting, laying in these larger shapes to help bring some volume to this head pretty quickly. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to look for my darkest darks first of all. Actually, I've got, as I'm looking at this, my darkest darks, the darkest of all of the values are obviously going to be the pupils here, maybe the nostrils, that little accent area, little accent areas. But when you look at this photo, things look, it looks as though some of these areas may also be the darkest value, but this is actually a little bit closer to what the actual values that I'm going to be using, somewhere in between here. And that brings up another good point, that the reason I have two different photographs here is because one, the darker photograph allows me to see inside of the lighter areas a little bit better. It has a little more information. As you can see in this one, it brings, they're very subtle, but it brings more information as far as the cheekbone and certain areas. In the lighter version, which I have over here, it gives me more information in the shadow areas. Some of these areas will just tend to look like one big mass, and if you lighten them up, then you can see little subtle differences. And little things like that are very important in a commissioned portrait, because those little things add character to the person, to the painting as well. And so those are things that I like to use as far as two different reference photos. And then also I'll also have a, I don't have it here today, but I will have my own laptop computer which sits next to me, which I'll have the same photo pulled up. And I can either lighten it or darken it, just take it into Photoshop or any program like that, and you can either lighten it or darken it. It's like having your own instant photo lab, and that's basically what I use it for, is to be able to get instant results that I'm looking for, making things lighter or darker. So now once I have those things in, I am ready to go ahead and start blocking in the painting. So what I'll do is I'll mix, I'm going to mix something for this just for this background color here. I'll put a little bit of Prussian green, a little bit of cadmium orange, and a little bit of gold ochre, and then I'll take a little bit of that manganese blue as well. Just to get a sort of a neutral, more of a neutral color. Add a little bit of that manganese blue in there too. I'm going to add a little bit of manganese blue and a little bit of cadmium scarlet, actually, to just to lay a sort of a reference point. I'll add a little bit of raw sienna in there too. I'm going to actually lay this shadow right in here. I'm going to put that in there just to give me a reference point, actually, before I start working on that, blocking in that background. As I mentioned earlier, I like to work, start from darker values and work my way up, and the reason I do that is because it's much easier to judge value relationships based on your darkest values than it is to if I started out and put my lightest value, which is a white, if I put that on there. If you base your value scale or your value scheme on your lightest value, the tendency is to end up with a painting that is ends up too light in value. It just seems to work out better with when you base everything on your darkest values. I'm just working on getting these big shapes here. Actually, as I look at this, I'm going to bring this up much higher here, actually. Probably in here. One thing with children's faces is that the bottom portion is kind of scrunched, and I have more of an adult head here as I'm looking at this, and just need to keep that in mind as I go. So I'm going to move that mouth up actually somewhere in there. This is going to be a little bit darker than what I'm actually going to keep it, but I'll show you what I can do to lighten it up. I don't use any mediums, so there's no mediums that I'm working with here. It's just what I call solid paint, meaning that you're not thinning it down at all. What I'm doing is just getting a large value down so that I can have something to work with. If at all possible, use the biggest brush that you can, just to lay things in. Before I go on, I'm going to show you I'm going to lighten this background up a little bit. The way that I do that is I use these Viva paper towels. What I do is I just fold them, fold a portion of them, just like that basically, so that it's a nice smooth side. I'll just push it around. There's no medium in here, it's just pushing the paint that was already down, that solid paint. Just switch the value up behind head here a little. Just going to try to mix a color here for just to introduce the dark part of that hair, like a sap green. And gold ochre and a little bit of red. It's too dark. So I'll add some more raw sienna. Right now I'm just finding the darkest areas here. I'm just going to put a general area of where those eyes are going to be. A lot of times I'll look into a handheld mirror just to give me an idea as far as how my drawing looks, because the handheld mirror will show you right off the bat whether or not you're on the right track or not. You should be able to see some imperfections very quickly. One of the things to note when you're working on portraits, one of the first things I'm trying to get, I'm never trying to get a likeness right off the bat, meaning that I'm not trying to make it look just like that person right at the very beginning, because what's more important is to try to get the gesture of a person, the character, the feel for their personality in some way. And that's really what I'm after at the beginning stages here, is to try to capture some of that personality. It's one thing to paint a boy or a girl or a man or a woman, but it's another thing to paint a specific person. That's a totally different thing altogether, because you're having to please a client. And ultimately, when it comes to painting commission portraits, you want to please the client, because they're the one who's investing in it, in the artwork itself. And the reason they've chosen you for their portrait, or to have, to paint their portrait, is because they're looking for your particular interpretation. They don't want they're not looking for a photocopy. I'm not trying to get this painting to look just like this photograph. That's not the goal. The goal is to interpret the photograph, to interpret the subject that's in front of you, and put that interpretation onto canvas. So when a lot of people, most art buyers, art collectors, they want to, if they buy a particular artist, they're paying for that artist's particular interpretation of the subject, and not just for a color reproduction of a photograph. So that's just something to keep in mind. I am just putting in these dark areas, these dark values. There's not really any of those flesh tones that you would normally think of that are in there yet, but I don't put those in there quite yet. I'm not quite ready for those yet. Just following these little shadow areas, sort of filling in the gaps as I go along. It's kind of like, in a lot of ways, it's like a puzzle, and each one of these values and shapes that you put down is like a puzzle piece. And if you can put them all down in the correct spots with the correct values, the correct shape, correct color, the ideal situation, if you could do all that at the same time, what you end up with is whatever subject that is in front of you, or that you're trying to paint. Because really, when we paint, you notice that I didn't do a drawing at the beginning. Part of the reason is that by doing a drawing, you're trying to define form by lines, boundaries around objects, and that's really not how we see things in nature. That's why I like to start out with these big shapes. I think we're ready to move on a little bit. I like to move around the canvas quite a bit. I don't like to really stay in one particular area at a time, just for the fact that I like to have it sort of develop as a whole. once I have those dark areas in, then I can start to move around more into the middle values. When I talked earlier about grays in my other segment, about mixing colors and mixing flesh tones, this is one of those areas where an example of one of those grays. This is more of a grayish color that I'm adding in here. And as the form churns, where it goes from light to shadow, grays often occur in there as well. And a gray comes as a result of mixing complements together. Just trying to add some warmth here with this sort of a pinkish color. A lot of times with portraits, especially with children and women, you can add, men as well, but not so much. You can add a little more of a pinkish tint to the nose, to the chin, even to the ears a little bit. And it just helps to add a little more life into the painting. And try to add a little bit of that little color to that ear. Or let's actually put in an ear. A lot of times when people are watching artists paint, they can't quite see what's going on sometimes. When in actuality, the artist is actually thinking probably 2 or 3 moves ahead down the road, and all this stuff is sort of, every stroke that goes down is sort of setting up the stage for another 2 or 3 strokes down the road. Values are extremely important. Value sets the stage on which color performs. I often tell people that because a lot of times people think that artists a lot of times think that color is the problem that they're having with their painting, when in actuality it's value, because if the value's not right, the colors are not going to be right. So that's why value relationships, meaning how all the values work together in the painting, why it's so important to try to get those right. As I'm looking at this photo, a lot of times I'm sort of half squinting my eyes. And what that does is it actually simplifies the values even more. So as you half squint and you look at your subject, whether it's a photograph or whether it's from a live model, by half squinting you're actually not allowing as much light to come into your eyes. And by not allowing as much light to come into your eyes, you're actually getting rid of a lot of the detail. And what's left, those big shapes, that's really what you want to capture, because those big shapes, those big values are what's important. John Singer Sargent, late 19th century painter, one of my favorite artists, he was a master at this. His portraits, he pretty much narrowed them down to about 5 values. And his portraits are so strong, from a distance you can look at those things and it's almost as if the person could speak to you. And it's because he's kept those values so simple and so just a very simple value scale that he's used. Very powerful. And another thing, by keeping your values simple, you're not, by not breaking the values up so much, it actually, it's more appealing to the viewer, because that's the way they take things in when they actually see things out in nature. They don't see a bunch of little broken up things. Your eye tends to take things in as a whole. And by breaking up a value too much, you're actually creating too much interest, too much attention actually is going to be drawn to that particular area. So that's just one thing to think about when you're putting your values together. your value relationships and comparing them. I keep talking about comparing values. I'll tell you this real quick. I have here a value scale, and basically it goes from black to white, and there's various grays in between. And this value scale basically it represents the range of lights and darks that you can get using pigment, which is what we're using. This is as light as I can go in paint, and this is as dark as I can go in paint. And everything in between is just a variation of a mixture of both of those colors. Now, value is extremely important because every color that you paint with has a value, whether you know it or not. Every color has a value, and because of that, it's a great thing for artists because every color has a value. That means it can be measured. So, in other words, I can measure, say, from this darkest value, I could jump 3 values, 1, 2, 3, and I could go from that value to this value, and I can compare how dark they are. Just with these 2 values in between, I can compare and see how dark they are. That constant comparison is very important in order to achieve the look of a 3-dimensional object. And so when I talk about judging and judging values and comparing values, that is a constant process that I'm doing all throughout the painting. As I'm laying these strokes down, it's, okay, what's the value? How does that value look compared to another value? And it's a constant comparison back and forth. And if you can get those values correct, at the end of your painting, you should have something that resembles that 3-dimensional object. And in representational art, which is what I do, that's extremely important. And I just wanted to note, to say that to you as well, just to reference that and to let you know that values are an extremely important thing. And value relationships and learning how to get values to work together was probably one of the most difficult concepts for me to actually grasp, and it takes some getting used to. But once you work with it enough, you'll start to realize how important values are. When it comes to painting and representational art, I would say the 2 most important. There are four basic principles that guide and govern every decision that you make in art, and that is drawing, value, color, and edges. And I would say that drawing and value are the most important of those 4, because drawing is what's going to make having those shapes in the right place and having those the correct drawing is going to make it look like whatever object you have in front of you, and then the value is going to give it that 3-dimensional quality, that look of actually some form, and that's very important. And if it was a choice between which are the 2 most important out of the 4, I would definitely say drawing and value. Color is closely related to value, but color is actually what you incorporate into a value, if that makes sense. So value is more important, I would say, than color. Understanding value is the basis of is the first step in understanding color. And then edges are very important too, because they allow you to soften an edge and create more of an illusion of a 3-dimensional form as well. But edges are not nearly as important as drawing and value, if I was to put them in a particular order. I'm going to go ahead and put let's go ahead and throw this in. As you can tell, I really haven't started to do any type of blending or mixing these colors, softening. I'm not going to even do that until I've got enough information down here. And then those are things that I can modify later on, which is, it doesn't take a whole lot to do that either. When it comes to painting heads or working on head studies, they're much more relaxing if there's not a client involved. there's not that added pressure, because a lot of times when you're working on a commission piece, instead of just painting it the way I want to, I'm always thinking in the back of my mind, what is the client thinking? What is the client going to want? And that's really makes a big difference in how you approach and how you, to the degree of finish that you actually take a painting that has a lot to do with it.